Well, hello there. I'm Mike Batty from CASA in University College London, and I was very pleased that you invited me to the Space Syntax Symposium in Beijing. But unfortunately, I've been in China for quite a bit this summer, and I really had to get back from the Computers in Urban Planning and Urban Management conference in Wuhan back to UCL. So unfortunately, I'm not able to actually be with you. I like the Space Syntax Conference. There's a lot of very interesting things that I'm sure you're going to be discussing in that sense. So I thought I'd say a little bit about my own work in space syntax over the years. I've done a little bit of work in space syntax really over the last 20-25 years since I've been in UCL. There are many interesting kind of directions in the field which I think are ripe for exploitation in many senses. There's been a revolution in network science, of course, over the last 20 years, and that has provided lots of interesting views about street networks and other kinds of networks. Had I been able to attend the meeting in Beijing, then I probably would have talked about some work I did when I was visiting the Chinese University of Hong Kong a couple of years ago. I wrote a paper then on the relationship between space syntax and spatial interaction models. And to an extent, in spatial interaction models, of course, we're interested in flows and we're much less interested in the underlying network. Whereas in space syntax, one is interested in the network itself, and to some extent, the flows are incidental. So the difference between spatial interaction and space syntax is the difference between flows and networks. Of course, pointing it out in that fashion, then the key interest, I think, would be to actually join the two together. So that's what I attempted to do back a couple of years ago in a working paper which really linked spatial interaction to space syntax. Now the paper is available, I'll give you a free advert for it. The paper is available in our working paper series. Jamie, who's videoing this little movie basically, are you able to pan in, Jamie? So there we go. Okay, so that's the working paper itself. You can download it. Our working papers are less prolific these days than they used to be, that the online world is changing much of that, so you can see that. If you actually drill down into this, then it illustrates this paper, one of the kind of key things that I want to say by way of introduction. So I've downloaded the paper, there it is. I'm going to scan through it and just come to a couple of graphs in a moment. What we essentially did was to look at the street network in London and also to look at the spatial interaction flows on the street network in that context. Okay, so what I'd like to talk about in the next 5 minutes really, before I actually round off and let you get on with the conference, is I want to really talk about an issue that really is very central to space syntax and increasingly central, I think, to what one might do in terms of research. Recently, a chap called David Levinson, who's a transportation planner, transportation engineer, working now at the University of Sydney, he wrote to me and he asked me the question, he said, when did people studying networks first talk about the idea of the primal and the dual in terms of networks? Now, I first encountered this issue many years ago, not in terms of spatial networks, but in terms of social networks. In fact, I did a lot of work in the 1970s on design methods, basically, following on from the early 60s work of people like Christopher Alexander, where essentially one looked at networks of relationships between different factors involved in a design problem. And this work led to ideas in terms of social networks. And there's a very well-known book written by James S. Coleman called The Mathematics of Collective Action, published sometime in the 1970s. And essentially what Coleman said is that if you have two sets of objects, let's say those objects are plots and streets, okay, sort of aerial plots where you have houses and buildings and so on, and streets, then you have a matrix which enables you to say which plot is on which street, essentially, which is a matrix in that sense. Then you can actually generate the relationships between the plots through the streets and the relationships between the streets through the plots. So if you take a plot street matrix, and its transform. Essentially multiply the two together using matrix multiplication. You get a plot-to-plot relationship matrix. If you do the same with streets and plots the other way around, in that context you get a street-to-street relationship. And these two things are the primal and the dual. We can call the plot matrix basically the primal and the street matrix the dual, or indeed it's quite arbitrary which one we call in that sense. So in a sense you can expand ideas about networks in terms of two sets of objects. That's the generic kind of idea. All right, now of course these ideas go back a long way. They go back to sociology in the 70s, and they go back even before. In fact, in modern mathematics, I think the idea of the primal and the dual is very central to ideas about networks and relationships in that sense. Now, David Levinson, who asked me this question, he'd seen a paper we did with Paolo Masucci on looking at the street network in London, which I think was published in Physical Review around about 2010. But in fact, in space syntax, I wrote a paper in 2003 called A New Theory of Space Syntax, where we actually exploited this idea of duals and primals quite extensively. And indeed, if you look at my book, The New Science of Cities, which came out in 2013, here's an unashamed plug for the book, basically. You can see in that book, I really exploit this idea about primals and duals in networks quite extensively. Indeed, not many people who looked at the book have really picked this up, basically, but really the whole book is about primals and duals in some sense, not just in terms of social networks. Part 3 is really about social and design networks, but parts 1 and 2 are really building this notion that when we look at interaction or relationships in that sense, we've got to dig below it and talk about the things that are forming interactions. Essentially, that's one of the kind of key things. Now, in fact, I think that in the book by Lionel March and Phil Steadman, The Geometry of the Environment, which is a great book, a lovely book, published in 1971 by RIBA Press, they talk quite a bit about duals and primals, but not particularly in the context that I've been talking about today. I should just say that Phil Steadman is republishing the book. Lionel, of course, passed away last year, basically, and he indeed was the founder, of course, of Environment Planning B, which I'm still the editor of. And anyway, it's very fitting that the book should be reissued. And in fact, Phil asked me to write a foreword to the book, which really sort of talks about this wider context. Okay, so let me really summarize what I'm really saying here, that were I to have come, I would have talked extensively about duals and primals in the context of spatial interaction and space syntax in that particular context. We can find this in the working paper that is on the screen there. But really, in some sense, my message, I think, is that in space syntax, we really should break out of the primal box, really, and begin to look at the duals, or if you call space syntax the dual, then we break out of the dual box and look at the primal in that sense. And that's a very rich kind of paradigm, I think, that we can actually exploit. It's a kind of research program in waiting to some extent, which I think can be developed very easily and quickly in the context of space syntax. Indeed, there are many hints to this, that the work of people like Sergio Porter and so on, and various people in network science itself. Mark Bartholomew, I think, addressed you a couple of years ago a few years ago when Space Syntax Conference was in Korea. All of these sorts of things, I think, are there to be actually picked up in terms of a research program. So without more ado, let me say that I'm very pleased to be able to address you in terms of this short video, and I look forward to seeing the proceedings of the conference, and I hope that you all have a very good conference there in China. Thank you.